Somewhere in the tall grass of the Ohio Valley, there is a wall of earth shaped into a perfect circle. Walk its edge, and it runs for over 1,000 feet without wavering. Next to it sits an octagon so precise that surveyors 2 centuries later found its angles lined up with the swing of the moon across an 8-year cycle. There are squares that cover dozens of acres. There are earthen animals hundreds of feet long. And when white settlers first stood inside these shapes in the early 1800s, they looked at them and they decided that the people already living there could not possibly have built them. That decision was not an accident. It was not a harmless mistake. It became one of the most successful and most convenient lies in American history, a lie that filled books, sold newspapers, shaped laws, and gave a young country a story it desperately wanted to hear. The story went like this. Long ago, a lost race of master builders. Civilized, advanced. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence. Discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Maybe even white. Came to this continent, raised these monuments, and then vanished. And the native people found living among the ruins? They were framed as intruders, squatters on someone else's genius. This is the story of that lie. Where it came from, who profited from it, how it was finally destroyed by a single government report, and why, more than 100 years later, the exact same idea is climbing back out of the ground under new names. Because if you have seen the videos about star forts and a hidden empire called Tartaria, you have already met this ghost. You just did not know how old it was. Let's start with what is actually out there, because it is genuinely staggering. Across the eastern half of North America, from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf, the ground is marked with tens of thousands of earthworks, mounds shaped like cones and platforms and animals. Enclosures shaped like circles, squares, octagons. Some are burial sites. Some held wooden buildings on their flat summits. Some seem built to track the sun and moon. At a place called Cahokia, just across the river from Modern Street, Louis, one earthen pyramid covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. Around the year 1100, the city surrounding it may have held more people than London did at the time. These were not thrown up by accident. They represent staggering amounts of organized labor, baskets of soil carried by hand, sometimes millions of them, coordinated across generations. They are, by any honest measure, one of the great achievements of the ancient world. Take one example, because it makes the scale real. In what is now Newark, Ohio, there is a complex of earthworks so large that a golf course was later laid out inside part of it. At its heart sits an enormous octagon joined to a perfect circle, the walls running for thousands of feet. In the 1980s, 2 researchers studied the geometry and made a discovery that should have been front-page news. The octagon is aligned to the moon. Not the sun, which is the easy one, but the moon, whose rising and setting points drift back and forth across a complicated cycle that takes 18.6 years to complete. The builders had tracked that cycle closely enough to freeze its extremes into the ground. To do that, you have to watch the sky carefully across decades, keep records somehow, and then engineer a monument to match. That is not the work of a people who built nothing. That is an observatory made of earth. Or, take the Great Serpent Mound, also in Ohio. A 1/4-mile-long snake of raised earth, curling across a ridge, its jaws open around an oval. From the ground you can barely tell what it is. From the air it resolves into one of the most striking pieces of monumental art on the continent. Somebody designed that to be understood from a vantage point they themselves could never reach. And then there is Cahokia, which deserves more than a passing mention, because it dismantles the myth all by itself. This was a genuine city. At its peak around the year 1100, it sprawled across thousands of acres, with a planned central plaza, residential neighborhoods, and more than 100 mounds. Its builders realigned the whole settlement to a grid. They erected a ring of tall wooden posts that functioned as a solar calendar, marking the solstices and equinoxes. They organized labor on a scale that required real political power and social coordination. This was not a scattering of huts. It was an urban center in North America, centuries before any Europeans set foot here. And here is the fact that the entire lost race myth was built to bury. We know who made them. They were made by the ancestors of the native nations who were living right there, the Hopewell and Adena peoples. The Mississippian culture, the direct forebears of the Muskogee, the Osage, the Ho-Chunk, the Cherokee, and many others. There was never a mystery about the builders. There was only a country that did not want the answer. So how did the lie take hold? To understand that, you have to go back to the early 1800s and stand where those settlers stood. Picture a farmer pushing west into Ohio around 1820. He clears trees, he breaks ground, and he keeps running into these massive geometric earthworks, perfect circles, straight-sided squares bigger than his whole village. He has been told, and he wants very badly to believe, that the land in front of him is empty, unclaimed, waiting for people like him to give it purpose. That is the entire promise that pulled him out here. But the earthworks are a problem, because monuments mean history. History means someone was here first, someone with roots and rights and a claim. And the people who could make that claim, the native nations, were exactly the people the United States was in the middle of pushing off this land by treaty, by pressure, and by force. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. Over the following decade, the government forced tens of thousands of native people off their homelands in the east and marched them west on the route the Cherokee would remember as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died along the way. Now hold those two things in your mind at the same time. On one hand, a nation forcibly removing native people and insisting they were primitive wanderers with no real claim to the land. On the other hand, undeniable monuments proving that sophisticated, settled societies had shaped this continent for thousands of years. Those two stories cannot both stand. One of them has to break. And you can watch educated men of the era tie themselves in knots over it. Some of the founders and early presidents were fascinated by the mounds. A few investigated them seriously and honestly. But the broader culture kept sliding toward the flattering answer, because the flattering answer paid. If the mounds were the work of a vanished superior race, then the land had, in a sense, already been civilized once and then abandoned, left waiting to be redeemed by new settlers, who saw themselves as heirs rather than invaders. It let a farmer stand inside a 2,000-year-old monument and feel like he was reclaiming a lost inheritance rather than ploughing through someone else's sacred ground. So the myth stepped in and broke the true one. It said, simply, "The people we are removing did not build these. A greater lost race did. The native peoples destroyed them or replaced them or never had anything to do with them at all." Suddenly, the earthworks stopped being an inconvenient truth and became a comforting fantasy. The monuments no longer belonged to the people being marched away. They belonged to phantoms, and phantoms cannot file a claim. And follow the money here, because this is where it stops being just a story and becomes an economy. The whole engine of westward expansion ran on land. Land surveyed, land sold, land granted to railroads, land handed to settlers who would turn it into farms and towns and tax revenue. Every acre had to come from somewhere, and it came from treaties broken and territories seized. A theory that quietly detached the land from any prior legitimate owner was not a harmless curiosity. It was a lubricant for the largest transfer of real estate in the continent's history. The lost race myth told buyers and homesteaders and speculators that the ground beneath them had no rightful heirs, only ancient ghosts and the wandering savages who had supposedly displaced them. That made the paperwork feel clean. It turned dispossession into settlement and theft into development. This is the part that matters most, so I am going to say it plainly. The lost race theory was not born from evidence. It was born from need. It solved a moral problem for a country that did not want to look at what it was doing. And once a lie is that useful, it does not stay in whispered conversations. It gets written down, printed, and taught. Which brings us to the books, and there were a lot of them. Through the 1800s, the mystery of the mound builders became a genuine publishing phenomenon. Writers filled shelves with theories, and almost all of them shared one rule. Whoever built the mounds, it was not the ancestors of Native Americans. Everyone else was fair game. The builders were said to be a lost tribe of Israel, or wandering Phoenicians, or Egyptians, or Vikings, or refugees from sunken Atlantis, or a vanished white race that had been wiped out by the savage ancestors of the people now living there. You can hear the move in that last one. It flips victim and villain. In the myth, the native peoples are no longer the ones being dispossessed. They are recast as the original destroyers, the ones who slaughtered the noble mound builders and stole their land. Which meant that anything now being done to them could be dressed up as a kind of cosmic justice. The theory did not just erase native achievement, it manufactured a grudge to justify removal. And the myth was flexible, which is part of why it spread. If you were religiously inclined, the mound builders could be a lost tribe of Israel, a comforting idea that folded the new world neatly into the pages of the Bible. If you preferred the classical world, they were Phoenicians or Greeks blown off course. If you liked a tragedy, they were a gentle, doomed people wiped out by barbarian hordes. The theory could be whatever you needed it to be, because it was never anchored to anything real. It floated free, and that made it endlessly reusable. Poets got hold of it too. The lost mound builders showed up in verse, mourned as a noble vanished race. Their imagined extinction turned into something beautiful and sad. That is a particularly effective way to launder a lie, by the way. Once a false idea becomes the subject of art, once people feel something tender about it, arguing against it starts to feel cold, like you are the one attacking beauty. The myth wrapped itself in sentiment, and sentiment is armor. One book towered over all the others. In 1833, a writer named Josiah Priest published a sprawling collection of these theories. It sold in enormous numbers for its era, tens of thousands of copies, which made it one of the great bestsellers of the early Republic. It packed together lost tribes and ancient invasions and vanished empires into one thrilling, unverified stew. And it taught a whole generation of Americans to look at an earthwork and feel not respect for the people around them, but goosebumps about a lost golden age. And the myth did not just distort the record on paper. It did real, physical damage to the sites themselves. If the mounds belonged to a vanished race rather than to living people with any claim, then there was nothing sacred about tearing them open. Across the 1800s, countless mounds were ploughed flat for farmland, levelled for roads and buildings, or cracked apart by treasure hunters and curiosity seekers convinced they would find the relics of some lost empire inside. Skeletons were dug up and carted off. Artifacts were scattered into private collections and sold. An enormous amount of irreplaceable history was destroyed, and the myth was the permission slip. It is a bitter irony worth sitting with. The same story that claimed to honor a great lost civilization was, in practice, the thing that gave people license to bulldoze the actual monuments of a real one. Here is what I want you to notice. Almost none of this was based on excavation. It was speculation, stacked on speculation, sold as revelation. It followed a formula that should sound extremely familiar if you spend any time online today. Take a real, impressive structure, detach it from the people who actually made it, attach it instead to a mysterious vanished civilization, and then present the official, boring, documented explanation as the thing that they do not want you to know. The mounds were the original ancient mystery content, and they were monetized hard for the better part of a century. But not everyone bought it. And this is where the story turns, because the myth did not die on its own. Somebody had to kill it, and doing that took decades of patient, unglamorous work. There were skeptics early on. Some careful observers looked at the mounds, looked at the tools and pottery and bones inside them, and quietly concluded the obvious: that the ancestors of living native peoples had built them. But careful observation is a whisper, and the lost race myth was a scream. It was more exciting. It was more flattering. It sold more books. And it justified more land grabs. For most of the 1800s, the truth simply could not compete. Then, in the 1880s, the United States government did something that, for once, actually helped. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. Congress funneled money into the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology to settle scientific questions about native peoples, and the Bureau handed the mound question to a man named Cyrus Thomas. Now, here is the detail that makes this worth telling. Cyrus Thomas did not start out as a skeptic. When he began, he actually believed in the lost race. He accepted the popular idea that the mound builders were a separate, vanished people, distinct from Native Americans. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person the myth had convinced, which is what makes what happened next so powerful, because Thomas did the one thing the mythmakers almost never did. He went and dug. Starting in the early 1880s, Thomas ran a massive, systematic field survey. His teams fanned out across the eastern United States and investigated thousands of mounds, not reading about them, not speculating about them from a study lined with maps, physically excavating them, cataloguing what was inside, and comparing it, mound by mound, artifact by artifact, to the material culture of known native nations. And the deeper he dug, the more his beloved theory fell apart in his hands. He found continuity everywhere. The pottery in the mounds matched pottery made by native peoples. The tools matched. The burial practices matched. The construction techniques matched. In some regions, there were even records and traditions connecting living native communities directly to mound building, right up to the historic period. There was no cultural break, no sign of a superior race that had come and gone. Just an unbroken line running from the ancient builders to the people the United States was, at that very moment, confining to reservations. Think about what that survey actually involved. This was not one dramatic dig. It was thousands of them, spread across many states, carried out over years, generating a mountain of catalogued objects and measurements. It was slow, expensive, unglamorous, and often tedious. Nobody writes a bestseller about carefully comparing potsherds. But that patient, boring work is exactly what the mythmakers had skipped for 60 years, and it is the only thing that could settle the question. The lost race authors had written libraries. Thomas dug holes, and the holes won. There is something almost quiet and heroic in the way he handled being wrong. It would have been easy to bury inconvenient findings, to protect the theory he had started with, to protect his own earlier statements. Plenty of people do exactly that. Instead, he let the evidence overrule him in public, in print, at length. He essentially wrote a 700-page confession that the exciting idea he had once shared was false, and that the boring, humane, true idea was correct. That is what science is supposed to look like, and it is rarer than it should be. To his credit, and this is rare, Thomas followed the evidence instead of his pride. He changed his mind. In 1894, the Bureau published his findings in a report that ran to over 700 pages. Its conclusion was blunt and, by then, unavoidable. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the American Indians. There was no lost race. There never had been. The entire towering edifice of vanished Israelites and wandering Phoenicians and murdered white mound builders collapsed onto a single, quiet, evidence-backed sentence. The people who built the mounds were the people who had been here all along. You would think that would be the end of it. A definitive government study, hundreds of excavations, an author who had every reason to want the opposite result and reached this one anyway. Case closed. And in the world of professional archaeology, it more or less was. From that point on, serious researchers accepted what Thomas had proven. Everything discovered since, radiocarbon dating, DNA studies, detailed analysis of tools and construction, has only confirmed it and deepened it. The picture we have now is of indigenous societies of remarkable scale and sophistication, engineering the landscape across thousands of years. The science is not in doubt. It has not been in doubt for a very long time. In fact, the tools that arrived in the 20th century made the case airtight in ways Thomas could only have dreamed of. Radiocarbon dating let researchers place mounds and artifacts on a firm timeline, tracing the traditions back thousands of years and showing the long, continuous development of these cultures, rather than any sudden appearance of outsiders. Detailed studies of trade goods revealed networks moving copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, and obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, all converging on these centers. This was a connected continent, humming with exchange, long before the word America existed. And there is one more piece that the mythmakers never had to reckon with, because they preferred their vanished races safely dead and unable to talk back. The descendants are here. The nations whose ancestors built these places did not vanish. The Muskogee, the Osage, the Ho-Chunk, the Cherokee, and many others carry their own histories, their own connections to these sites. In recent decades, laws have begun, imperfectly, to recognize that connection, returning ancestral remains and sacred objects to the communities they were taken from. Some of these earthworks are now protected and honored, a few even recognized among the great heritage sites of the world. The people the myth erased are still speaking, and what they say lines up with what the shovels found. But a lie that useful does not just accept a death certificate. And this is the part I really need you to sit with, because it is the whole point. The lost race myth did not survive because of evidence. It never had evidence. It survived because of what it did for people. It made conquest feel clean. It turned theft into inheritance. It let a nation admire monuments while erasing the people who made them. That emotional job, that comfort, did not disappear in 1894. So the myth simply took off the mound builder costume and waited for a new one. And you have probably already met the new costume, because right now, if you scroll long enough, you will find a booming online world convinced that the real builders of history have been hidden from us. That there was a lost, advanced, global civilization wiped from the record. That the star-shaped forts scattered across the world, and the grand old buildings in our cities, and yes, the geometric earthworks of North America, are the leftovers of that vanished empire. The name that gets attached to it most often is Tartaria. The star forts are worth a word on their own, because they are a perfect case study in how the trick works. Those geometric, pointed star fortifications that ring old cities across Europe and beyond are not mysterious to historians at all. They have a well-documented origin. They were a military response to gunpowder. Once cannons could smash the tall, straight walls of a medieval castle, engineers redesigned fortifications into low, angled, star-shaped bastions that deflected cannonballs and let defenders cover every approach with crossfire. There are treatises about it. There are named engineers. There are dated construction records and account books. We know who built them, when, and why, right down to the math. But strip all that documentation away, show someone only the striking aerial shape, and add a whisper of, why would anyone build something this elaborate? And suddenly, a solved problem in military engineering becomes evidence of a hidden empire. Now, I want to be fair here, because the appeal is real and it is human. The buildings are beautiful. The earthworks are genuinely mysterious in their scale and precision. It is exciting to imagine a hidden chapter of history. There is also a real, sympathetic instinct buried in it, a sense that official history has left things out, which, honestly, it sometimes has. I understand completely why the idea is fun and why it pulls people in. That part I do not mock. But look at the machinery underneath, and it is the exact same machine from 1833. Take real, impressive structures, detach them from the people and cultures who actually built them. Assign them instead to a mysterious lost civilization. Then frame the documented, evidence-based history, the historians, the archaeologists, the dated records, as a cover-up by them. It is the mound builder myth wearing a new hat, and when it reaches for the earthworks of North America specifically, it does something genuinely ugly, even when the people repeating it have no idea they are doing it. It takes achievements that belong to Native American ancestors, achievements that were stolen from them once already by exactly this kind of story, and it steals them a second time. It hands Cahokia and the Ohio earthworks back to a fantasy empire. It re-erases the very people the 1,894 report worked so hard to restore to the record. That is why this old story matters. Not as a dusty academic footnote, but as a warning about how a certain kind of history gets made, because the pattern is always the same, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It starts with a real thing that inspires awe, a mound, a fort, a cathedral, a canal. Then it introduces a gap, a feeling that surely ordinary people, and especially these particular people, could not have done something this impressive. That gap is the crucial move, and it is almost always wrong, because ordinary people, working together over time, have done astonishing things all over the world. Then, into that manufactured gap, it inserts a mystery, a lost race, a hidden empire, a secret that the experts are supposedly hiding. And finally, it sells you the thrill of being one of the few who really knows. Every step of that feels like curiosity. It feels like waking up, like seeing past the official story. That is exactly why it is so effective and so hard to argue with. But look at who it erases every single time. In the 1800s, it erased the ancestors of native nations to justify taking their land. And when the modern version reaches these same North American sites, it erases them all over again, for entertainment this time instead of conquest. But the deletion is the deletion. There is a cleaner, and honestly more astonishing, story sitting right there the whole time. And it does not require a single lost race. It is the true story. That the indigenous peoples of North America built cities. That they raised earthen monuments larger at the base than the pyramids of Egypt. That they engineered enclosures aligned to the movements of the sun and the moon with an accuracy that still stuns surveyors today. That they sustained these achievements across many centuries, through trade networks that stretched much of the continent. And that they did it as themselves, with their own hands and their own knowledge. No phantom empire required. The lost race theory was never an upgrade to that story. It was a demotion of it. It looked at one of humanity's great achievements and, rather than crediting the people who accomplished it, invented ghosts to take the credit. It called that wonder. It was actually theft. Cyrus Thomas figured that out the hard way, by picking up a shovel and letting the ground correct him. He walked in believing the myth, and walked out having buried it, because he was willing to check. That is the whole difference between history and fantasy. One of them digs, the other one only dreams, and then asks you to distrust anyone who did the digging. So the next time a video slides across your screen promising that the true builders of some ancient wonder have been hidden from you, that the experts are lying, that a vanished super-civilization is the real answer, I would ask you to do one small thing. Ask who the story is taking the credit away from. Ask whose achievement is being handed to a phantom. Because more often than you would ever guess, the lost civilization turns out to be one that was never lost at all. It was standing right there, being told it had built nothing, while its own monuments rose behind it in the grass. The mounds are still out there. The Great Circle in Ohio still holds its perfect line. The octagon still tracks the moon across its long cycle, patient as ever. Cahokia's pyramid still throws its shadow across the Mississippi floodplain at sunset. The serpent still curls along its ridge with its jaws around the oval, waiting for the aerial view that finally makes sense of it. They were built by real people whose descendants are still here, still telling the story straight. The monuments were never the mystery. The mystery was always why a country would look at something so magnificent and work so hard to convince itself that the people standing in front of it could not possibly have made it. And notice how little has actually changed in the machinery, even as the costumes swap out. In 1833, the lie sold books and cleared land. Today it sells views and clicks. The motive downshifts from conquest to entertainment, which is a real difference and a smaller sin. But the core move is identical, and the casualty is identical. Somebody looks at a genuine human achievement, decides the obvious builders are not impressive enough or not the right kind of people, and gifts the credit to a phantom. Every time that happens, a real accomplishment gets quietly stolen and handed to a ghost that never existed and never lifted a single shovel of dirt. So the real revisionist history here is not the one with the hidden empire. It is the one that puts the credit back where it belongs. The mounds were not built by Tartarians or Atlanteans or a lost white race or wandering tribes of Israel. They were built by the ancestors of people who are still here, still standing on the same ground, still correcting the record. That is the version the evidence supports, and it is also the more remarkable one, by far. That question does not have an archaeological answer. It has a human one, and it is one worth remembering every time the ground tries to tell us the truth, and someone would rather sell us a ghost.